Welcome to English Revision with Mr. Johnston. We are going to analyse Mrs. Birling's interrogation today. Priestley uses this part of the play to reveal the darkest aspects of Mrs. Birling's nature that lie beneath her respectable appearance. But before we dive into this scene, let's revise what we have learnt so far about Mrs. Birling throughout the play. First of all, she comes from an upper-class background. The stage directions describe her as a cold woman. She seems to be in a loveless marriage with Arthur. She is also Arthur's social superior. She seems to be aware of Eric's drinking problem, but deliberately ignores it. Yet it is only during this interrogation that Priestley gives the audience its clearest insight into Mrs. Birling's character. Before we analyse this interrogation, let's summarise its key moments. First of all, Mrs. Birling reveals that she was the chairwoman of a Brumley Women's Charity Association. She seems to be quite proud of this position. She next reveals that a pregnant and desperate Eva Smith went to the charity for support. This is Eva's last-ditch attempt for help before she took her life. But Mrs. Birling ensured that the charity refused to support Eva Smith. Mrs. Birling instead condemns the drunken young idler who was involved with Eva Smith. She claims it is his responsibility for looking after the vulnerable woman. Now we get one of the play's most shocking twists. The inspector reveals that the man who Mrs. Birling has been condemning is in fact Eric, her own son. Let's now discuss what we're going to learn about Mrs. Birling's character through analysing this scene. We'll begin with our first idea. Mrs. Birling is a judgmental character. We can see this through Mrs. Birling's view of the poor. When the inspector asks her about the charity, Mrs. Birling claims it has done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases. Now, Mrs. Birling here is referencing a traditional perspective on poverty. This is a historic distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. In such a perspective, some poor members of society are deemed to be deserving or worthy of charitable support, while others are deemed to be undeserving or unworthy. Of course, the complication of such a perspective comes in trying to determine who actually counts as deserving or undeserving. Attempting to sort the poor into these two categories is likely to be influenced by one's prejudices and biases. Priestley uses Mrs. Birling's treatment of Eva Smith to reflect the shortcomings of this traditional perspective on poverty, as we're going to see. Now, Sybil herself admits that she was prejudiced against Eva Smith's case right from the start. In other words, she was unfairly opposed to granting Eva Smith support. She judges Eva without knowing her. Now, there seems to be two main causes of Mrs. Birling's prejudice. The first seems to come from Eva's status as a single mother. A Christian morality, which would have been more pervasive in 1912 society, would have viewed Eva's engagement in sexual relations outside marriage as sinful. Mrs. Birling is probably reluctant to grant support to a lady who she deems to be immoral and irresponsible. So that's one cause of Mrs. Birling's prejudice against Eva Smith. The second cause of Mrs. Birling's prejudice seems to arise from Eva's status as a working class woman. Sybil seems to believe that Eva is immoral because she is poor. We can see this through Mrs. Birling's disbelief in Eva's story. Eva claims that she refused to accept the money Eric stole for her. Mrs. Birling refuses to believe such a claim. She states that a girl of that sort would never refuse money. Why does she say this? Well, in Mrs. Birling's view, a girl of that sort, a working class girl like Eva Smith, would never have a decency to refuse money from others. Mrs. Birling seems to think that all working class people are naturally selfish. Now, perhaps there is a deeper reason for Mrs. Birling's anger at Eva Smith's claim. She may be insulted by the idea that the poor could act with the same morality that Sybil would associate with the higher social classes. Such an idea seems to undermine the notion that there is a clear distinction between the rich and the poor. Mrs. Birling thus refuses to accept that Eva could have acted with such respectability. Mrs. Birling's anger is further reinforced by the fact that Eva calls herself Mrs. Birling. On one level, Mrs. Birling seems irritated because Eva has lied, but there seems to be a deeper reason behind Mrs. Birling's reaction. Perhaps Mrs. Birling is angered because Eva has tried to forge a common link with her. She has called herself Mrs. Birling as if they belonged to the same family. The idea of Eva and Sybil sharing the same surname seems to suggest that they have a shared humanity, and that is an idea that Mrs. Birling refuses to accept. How could a rich lady like her have anything in common with a poor, working-class girl like Eva Smith? So Mrs. Birling is prejudiced against Eva Smith for two reasons. Firstly, Eva is a single mother, and secondly, Eva is a working-class woman. Inspired by this prejudice, Mrs. Birling ensures that Eva does not receive any support from the charity. Now, since this play is a work of social criticism, we must bear in mind that Priestley is always trying to critique some aspects of his society. Every scene in this play thus addresses some sort of social injustice. So we must ask ourselves this question: what is Priestley criticizing here? Here's my opinion. Priestley is exposing the shortcomings of charitable support for the poor and vulnerable. The playwright is demonstrating that such establishments can be swayed by the prejudices of the rich and powerful, as symbolized by Mrs. Birling, about who should and should not receive help. In such a view, charities alone cannot be relied upon to support the poor and vulnerable, people like Eva Smith. Priestley may therefore be suggesting that an alternative form of provision is needed for the poor and vulnerable. What sort of provision might this be? Perhaps Priestley is advocating a need for a welfare state here. This is a system in which a government takes responsibility for meeting the needs of its citizens, particularly the poor and vulnerable. In Priestley's view, only with the establishment of a socialist welfare state would the poor and vulnerable members of society, like Eva Smith, receive the help that they need. We have analysed how Priestley thus presents Mrs. Birling as a judgmental character. She judges Eva Smith and seems to condemn her as an immoral woman who is undeserving of support. But Priestley uses this extract to demonstrate that Mrs. Birling is in no position to judge the morality of others. This brings us to point 2. Mrs. Birling is a hypocritical character. A hypocrite is someone whose behaviour does not follow the high examples that they claim to follow. Someone who preaches one thing but does another. Mrs. Birling is a hypocrite. She seems to regard herself as a moral, virtuous woman. For example, she says that she is the chairwoman of a Brumley Women's Charity Association with dignity. These stage directions give the impression that she is proud of this charity work. You can nearly imagine her saying these words with a head held high. She probably enjoys the reputation that this position grants her. She regards herself as a benevolent woman who uses her wealth to help the less fortunate members of society. But Priestley uses this interrogation to demonstrate that Sybil's morality is a sham. Her treatment of Eva Smith demonstrates this. Mrs. Birling is not kind or generous at all. She is in fact remarkably cruel and judgmental. Now there's an irony to this. It is ironic that the chairwoman of a charity happens to be the play's least charitable character. We can therefore see that there's a big contrast between Mrs. Birling's presentation of herself and her callous behaviour. This character's hypocrisy is most clearly reflected by her scathing critique of Eva Smith's lover. She condemns this man as a drunken young idler, and states that he should be made an example of. Sybil clearly thinks that this man is an immoral lowlife, a man deserving public humiliation. Little does she know that she is condemning her own son. Now, Priestley is using dramatic irony here. Dramatic irony is when the audience knows more than the characters. As the audience, we probably guess right now that Mrs. Birling is condemning her own son. So Mrs. Birling is judging the very behaviour that is going on in her family. She is condemning the behaviour of the son that she has raised. What might Priestley be critiquing through this moment? Well, a useful way of thinking about Mrs. Birling is to take her as a play symbol of the upper classes. Perhaps Priestley is critiquing the double standards of the higher social classes. He is using Mrs. Birling's hypocrisy to reflect the hypocrisy of the rich. Mrs. Birling is proud of her appearance as a charitable woman, but fails to provide support for Eva Smith. Priestley may be suggesting that the rich are similarly proud of their superficial morality, but fail to care for the poor and vulnerable. So we have now demonstrated that Mrs. Birling is a judgmental character and a hypocritical character. We will now go on to our third and final point. Mrs. Birling is willfully ignorant. Now this is a useful term to understand. If you're ignorant, you're unaware of some things about the world or people around you. If you're willfully ignorant, you deliberately choose to ignore some things about the world or people around you. You might be aware of something, but you choose to be ignorant. You choose to not recognize it. Mrs. Birling has been willfully ignorant throughout the narrative. At the start of the play, Priestley hints that Mrs. Birling is aware of Eric's drinking problem, but deliberately ignores it. This aspect of Mrs. Birling's character is most revealed in a reaction to the news about Eric's behaviour. When the inspector reveals that Eric is the father of Eva Smith's child, Mrs. Birling responds, "I can't believe it, I won't believe it." Now, this reaction reveals a great deal about Mrs. Birling's perspective. Her words that she won't believe this news is particularly striking. It's not only that she doubts that Eric could display this irresponsible behaviour, she stubbornly refuses to believe it. Why does Mrs. Birling refuse to believe this news about Eric? Well, if she acknowledges that Eric is indeed the drunken young idler who slept with Eva Smith, she would be forced to abandon her positive view of her family. She would be forced to acknowledge that her family is not as respectable and moral as she would like to believe. Mrs. Birling is thus desperately attempting to retain her naive, rose-tinted perspective of her family during this moment. We could describe her as being willfully ignorant to her family's problems. She's probably deep down aware that Eric is indeed the father of Eva Smith's child, but she refuses to acknowledge this. She refuses to acknowledge the truth. What might Priestley be criticizing here? Well, to begin, let's remember to take Mrs. Birling as a symbol of the upper classes. Perhaps Priestley is critiquing the willful blindness of this group of society. Mrs. Birling deliberately ignores the immoral behaviour of her own family members. She deliberately ignores the problems in her own family. Perhaps Priestley is suggesting that the rich similarly deliberately ignore the social inequalities and injustices of the society around them. Now, in writing about these ideas, there is a common mistake that many pupils make. They often present their own interpretations as facts, especially when discussing the message that a writer is trying to convey. I'll give an example here. Priestley is using this moment to critique the double standards of the higher social classes. This is a sort of sentence that many pupils write in their essays. The difficulty with this sentence is it presents an opinion as a fact, it presents an interpretation as a fact, It is just this writer's opinion that Priestley is critiquing the double standards of the higher social classes here. We cannot say this for certain. This could cost you marks in the exam. It makes your writing sound a bit simplistic. Now, to fix this sentence, you want to use tentative language. This language demonstrates that we are discussing our own personal interpretation of a play. Here are some examples. Priestley may be, Priestley could be, and Priestley is possibly. Now let's fix this sentence. Priestley may be using this moment to critique the double standards of the higher social classes. This is now better. We are using tentative language to demonstrate that we are discussing our own personal interpretation of the text. Let us demonstrate how we could use tentative language with the next paragraph. Priestley may be using this moment to critique the double standards of the higher social classes. As a symbol of the rich and powerful, Mrs Birling's character could reflect the hypocrisy of this elite group of society. Perhaps Priestley is condemning the elite for priding themselves on adhering to superficial ideas of morality while ignoring the grim social inequalities and injustices of British society. In such an interpretation, the surface-deep morality of Mrs Birling mirrors that of the higher social classes. And there we go, a paragraph that uses tentative language. That's one tip for improving your essay writing. And that brings us to the end of this video. We have now analysed three aspects of this character. Mrs Birling is a judgmental character, Mrs Birling is a hypocritical character, and Mrs Birling is a willfully ignorant character. If you found this video helpful, you may like a copy of the Mrs Birling section of our textbook. It can be downloaded with the link in the information box below. The textbook comes complete with tables for writing notes on each idea, short writing tasks and exemplars. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. I will be releasing more videos throughout the next number of weeks and months. Our next video will analyse Eric's character. But for now, all the best.